Votes for Women, the Suffrage Movement in Shelby, Ohio. Hello, I'm Christina Yetzer-Drain. I first became interested in the suffrage movement in Shelby, Ohio when I saw this newspaper article from the Trenton, New Jersey Evening Times. It was written months after the event, but it really piqued my interest. My research has led me to fascinating stories of strong women who overcame ordeals in their own lives while leading change that would become the 19th Amendment. The roots of the women's suffrage movement started in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. They called a convention to discuss the social, civic, and religious condition and rights of women. It was organized by some local female Quakers and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was not a Quaker. Some of the attendees that came were a Quaker speaker named Lucretia Mott, and she was well known throughout the suffrage movement, and Frederick Douglass, who was the only African American attendee. This became an annual event up to the Civil War. 2 years later, the women of Ohio had their own convention in Salem, spurred by the Seneca Falls Convention and also the Ohio Constitutional Convention in Cincinnati. The event was highly publicized in the Anti-Slavery Bugle printed in Salem. Men weren't allowed to speak, vote, or sit on the platform. Later, women were heard at the Constitutional Convention, but the amendment to strike the word male from the state constitution failed 73-7. Elizabeth Cady Stanton later wrote about the convention in the History of Women's Suffrage, Volume 1. Never did men so suffer. They implored just to say a word, but no. The president was inflexible. No man would be heard. If one meekly arose to make a suggestion, he was at once ruled out of order. For the first time in the world's history, men learned how it felt to sit in silence when questions in which they were interested were under discussion. Also posted in the Bugle about that time was a letter from Lucius V. Pierce. Pierce was an attorney in Alabama and Ohio, a 5-term mayor of Akron, commander-in-chief of the Patriot Army of the West during the Canada Patriot War of 1837 to 1839. He also served in the Civil War, carrying the rank of general. He commanded Camp Chase in Columbus for a time. He was a staunch supporter for women's rights. So long has a woman been looked upon as the weaker vessel, as a beautiful toy for the amusement of the lords of creation, that it is almost political suicide for a man to claim for her an equal rank with himself. Politicians have declared that all are created equal. But when she asked to bear her part of it, she was told the law gave that to her husband. He could sell it, but she could not. Did she ask the right to vote in the formation of laws so as to secure her property to herself, she was told that the Constitution prohibited Negroes, Indians, and women from voting. Did she ask to have laws that would save a homestead for her and her children, she was told that she was meddling with politics, entirely out of the scope of female duties, that it was her duty to tend baby, hang on tea kettle, and patch trousers, while the noble lords of creation voted away her rights and property. Our actions have said to her, "You are beautiful and lovely and intelligent, but you don't know enough to take care of yourself or property. You are the servant of your husband, and you and your property and rights are merged in him and his." Let's talk about the Ohio Inheritance Law in 1850. If there was no will, the widow received only 1/3 of her husband's estate. Law enumerated what household items were left for her and her children. If the widow attempted to conceal items, she could face imprisonment. The will could stipulate a guardian other than the children's mother. And Ohio law in 1850 said that married women had no rights to their own earnings or to anything bought with those earnings. A mother had no legal control over her children except in the case of illegitimacy. An abused wife could testify against her spouse only if she could swear that her life was in danger. The Ohio Constitution of 1851, Article 5, Elective Franchise, Section 1 said that every white male citizen of the United States of the age of 21 years who shall have been a resident of the state 1 year next preceding the election, and of the county, township, or ward in which he resides, such time as may be provided by law, shall have the qualifications of an elector and be entitled to vote at all elections. Section 4 said, the General Assembly shall have power to exclude from the privilege of voting or of being eligible to office any person convicted of bribery, perjury, or other infamous crime. And then Section 6 said, no idiot or insane person shall be entitled to the privileges of an elector. Ohio women tried several times throughout the years to gain suffrage. The Ohio Constitutional Convention in 1851 was one case. The female suffrage lost 7 yeas to 72 nays. A petition from the Ohio Women's Right Association to the state legislature in 1854 was ignored. There was no action given. A judiciary committee recommended the constitutional amendment for suffrage, but it dies in the Senate. The Civil War began in 1861, and then by 1870, there were 31 suffrage associations in Ohio. The legislature defeated the recommendations for women's suffrage amendments in 1874, 88, 89, 90, 97, 98, and 1900. The U.S. did pass the 15th Amendment in 1870, saying the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That gave blacks the right to vote, but not women. The first suffragist to come to Shelby was a Miss Mary Neal from Salem, Ohio. She came in 1873 and spent a couple of days in Shelby speaking. The only record of it is from the Independent News of May 1st, 1873. A Madam Neal from Salem, Ohio, whom we take to be an ancient maiden, on Monday and Tuesday evenings made the town hall ring with her eloquence in favor of prohibition and women's rights. She had a fine audience. Caroline Eberhard from Massillon was the president of the Ohio Suffrage Association from 1891 to 1900. In 1894, she led the successful effort to secure school suffrage for Ohio women. She also gained for Ohio women the right to vote in municipal elections. As a result, there were several female school board candidates in upcoming elections. In 1897, Lenora Close and Sarah Wentz ran but lost. In 1913, Anna Fish lost. In 1921, after women had gained the right to vote, Clara Dick, Mary Rininger, Isabel Boyles, Anna Poland, and Nora Will all ran for the positions. Clara Dick and Nora Will became the first female school board members in 1921. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed in Hillsboro, Ohio in 1873. In 1887, a group from Shelby met at the Lutheran Church, but no formal union was made. In 1895, Mrs. Ellen J. Finney of Cleveland, president of the WCTU, and other speakers came to address Shelby women at the Presbyterian Church. In 1897, the Shelby WCTU was organized. An account from the Daily Globe at the time reveals a glimpse ahead, shows a reading room, a sewing class, a cooking school. Mothers, sisters, wives, come unite your efforts, and God helping us, we may do much good for Shelby. A reading room was established almost immediately by the WCTU on a second floor of a building in the Suter-Higgins block on East Main Street. At that time, there were at least a dozen saloons on Main Street in a 3-block area, including bars adjacent to them and across the street. Men and boys who worked in the factories were welcome to come and read newspapers, magazines, and play games. Books were donated later. Miss Carrie Marvin, a WCTU member from Mansfield, became the first librarian. Within 3 months, the WCTU formed a new group, the Shelby Reading Room and Library Association, to manage the library. By 1901, the library was moved to its current location through a donation from Daniel Marvin. By 1911, 6 states had given women the right to vote: Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Washington, and California. If you notice, all of these are Western states, so there was a reason they gave the women to vote. There was a shortage of women who wanted to move out west, and they thought that this would be a way to attract them. The Equal Franchise Association in Shelby was formed in February 1912 from a department of the WCTU. The president was Dr. Lydia DeVilbiss Schock. Vice president was Lizzie Marvin, secretary Mrs. Nettie Littleton, and the secretary was Mrs. Anna Bloomfield. The organization was effected for the purpose of binding together all men and women interested in equal suffrage, that more effective work may be done. About 1912, there were several factories that employed women, including the Richland Mazda Lamp Works, the Shelby Printing Company, Autocall, the Ohio Seamless Tube, and Shelby Candy and Manufacturing Company. Dr. Lydia DeVilbiss Schock was a doctor in Fort Wayne, Indiana, who came to Mansfield and then Shelby to practice. She married a music professor, A.K. Schock, from Mansfield in 1906. He was 22 years older than her. She set up her practice at 96 West Main Street in Shelby, and that also became a local area for the Equal Franchise Association to meet. She was the first president of that group. She was also the first female member of the Shelby Socialist Local, a president of the Anti-Tuberculosis Society in the area, and a member of the Shelby-Richland County Medical Societies. Dr. Schock, in one of her first speeches to the Equal Franchise Association, said, "There are approximately 600 women in Shelby working for a living in the shops, stores, and offices. These women are working on practically equal terms with the men employed in similar occupations. Many of these women support not only themselves, but parents, brothers and sisters, children, and in some instances, husbands. Most of these women work under exceptionally favorable conditions, but unfortunately, not all women in Ohio are similarly situated." For men from entirely separate walks of life to elect men from other walks, to enact laws for these working women, and permitting them no voice in the matter, is about as ridiculous as for a physician to attempt to diagnose and prescribe for a pain without consulting the patient, who is the one vitally interested in the matter. In Ohio, the insane, idiots, paupers, criminals, and female citizens are denied the right to full citizenship. As a nation depends for its life upon its mothers, and as it rises or falls with its women, is it not time that this stigma be removed from Ohio womanhood? There were several suffragists who came to Shelby in 1912. In May, there was a rally at the Opera House, and it included Mrs. Maud Wood Park, Miss Rose Schneiderman, and Miss Florence Luscombe. The Opera House was decorated in yellow and white, and ushers wore white dresses with yellow sashes that said, "Let the women of Ohio vote, make Ohio next." Miss Margaret Foley came in June and made the rounds of Shiloh, Tyro, and Plymouth, as well as Shelby. In July, Miss Elizabeth Freeman and Miss Rosalie Joan delivered addresses on street corners and distributed literature. A letter from Harriet Taylor Upton, who was the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association president and organizer of the tour for Margaret, wrote to her on June 26th, saying not to go to Shelby. "You are a power of yourself, and that I have other work for you, and that you cannot do this. I am writing you personally to tell you to get away from Mrs. Schock and stay away, to trust me in this regard, and that I will explain when I see you." Whether Margaret didn't get the letter in time or ignored it is not known, but she did come to Shelby. There were also several anti-suffrage visitors who came to Shelby in 1912. In July, Miss Florence Montgomery and Miss Julia Olson, schoolteachers from Lorraine, came through the area. In August, Miss Minnie Bronson came. She later became the General Secretary for the National Association opposed to women's suffrage in Washington, D.C. The Daily Globe published several promotional articles prior to Miss Minnie Bronson coming to town. In those articles, she said she didn't understand why employers wanted women and men to do the same work. Schock used the opportunity for a rebuttal in the newspaper. Her chief qualification seems to be her ability to draw a nice fat salary from a lot of misguided women and moneyed politicians to come to Ohio and tell the working women how to attend to their own business. Hats off to Miss Bronson. Local writer Lizzie Marvin wrote afterwards about Minnie's speech. The speaker gave a heart-rending, tear-starting, hysteric-provoking picture of the disrupted homes to follow the enfranchisement of women. This was a high-class, farcical comedy in which even the leading lady must have found amusement. Lizzie Marvin was a prominent figure in the suffrage movement in Shelby. She frequently visited nearby towns to speak. In 1893, she printed and published the Shelby Weekly Echo, but she had to stop because of ill health. She wrote for the Daily Globe throughout the suffrage movement and later as a columnist. A leader in the suffrage movement in the early 1900s, she was also a prominent Democrat. She was a census taker for Precinct G, Sharon Township, in 1920. In 1927, while in her 50s, Lizzie married itinerant umbrella mender Charles DeVary. She filed for divorce after 3 months. They had known each other for 5 years. The feud started with coffee grounds. He wanted her to reuse them, and she threw them out. The final fight ended with a call to the police about wife beating. In a very public trial, she claimed he was a drunk, and he claimed she was a gold digger. She was awarded $500 alimony. She asked for her name to be restored to Marvin, but at the time of the divorce, she kept the DeVary name for business reasons. Columbus hosted a parade in 1912 leading up to the election. Mrs. Harriet Taylor Upton, president of the Ohio Suffrage Association, headed up the parade. Women marchers were 4,000 in number, each under 100 banners designating their trade or profession. Dr. Lydia DeVilbiss Schock marched with the women physicians, 25 in line. Mrs. Minnie Wiggins of Shelby and Miss Ruth Bishop of Chicago Junction, now Willard, carried a banner in which read, "Shelby, the town that does things." The banner was greeted with a great amount of applause along the 5 miles of march, the crowd singing "Shelby, Shelby, Shelby," cries of "Oh, you Tube Town" and "Oh, you Mazda Lamp Town." At one point, the boosters became so boisterous that the police called them down, telling them that rowdyism is not tolerated on the streets of the capital city in honor of Shelby. Many women also stood on soapboxes to speak to anyone who would stop to hear. Dr. Schock made an impromptu speech on the Capitol grounds. She hopped up on one of the stones beside the walk, gathered a large group of farmers from the southern part of the state about her, and began to lay down the reasons why the women should have the vote. The proposed Ohio 23rd Amendment read, "Every citizen of the United States of the age of 21 years who shall have been a resident of the state 1 year preceding the election, and of the county, township, or ward in which he or she resides such time as may be provided by law, shall have the qualifications of an elector and shall be entitled to vote at all elections." The amendment failed, with only one congressional district passing the amendment. 24 counties passed the amendment, mostly in the North. The Daily Globe was full of comments. From a suffrage worker, "I am stunned by the blow. It doesn't seem possible to me that the manhood of the state of Ohio is responsible. I felt so confident in their judgment, their generosity, and chivalry." From one of Shelby's prominent attorneys, "So many people were misinformed about the amendments that they just got frightened and voted straight. That is, all with the exception of women's suffrage. They were able to figure that out for themselves to a certain degree, and many, influenced by some old-fashioned prejudice or controlled by a certain element, voted it down." Dr. Schock said, "The women of Ohio are disappointed but not discouraged. So far as they are concerned, the fight has just begun." The brewery interests opposed us bitterly, believing that the enfranchisement of women would endanger or prohibit the liquor traffic. As a matter of fact, the 6 women's suffrage states are not prohibition states. We were much gratified with the result in Shelby, having carried the city by 27 majority. We are unable to say just what form the next campaign will take, but the citizens may rest assured that the majority of Ohio women want the ballot and will continue their campaign until they get it. The next campaign will not be left to a minority to carry on the active work, and I predict that for every woman actively engaged in the campaign this year, there will be at least 25 or 30 on the fighting line next time. But Dr. Schock stepped down from the Equal Franchise Association shortly after the election. She quietly began to move heirlooms out of the house and secured Skiles, Green, and Skiles to file for divorce. She left for Fort Wayne shortly before Thanksgiving. Professor Schock found out about the divorce after seeing a headline in a paper while waiting for the interurban car back to Shelby. He wrote a 4-column rebuttal claiming extreme cruelty, that she struck him with items and threw a butcher knife at him. Lydia finally dropped the case, but she didn't return to Shelby. In 1914, she became the medical director with Better Babies Bureau of the Women's Home Companion. Mary Ross Rininger became the president of the Equal Franchise Association in 1813 after Dr. Schock left town. She was a widow with a young son who had just moved to town from Tyro. Mary and Will married in 1900 and moved to St. Louis, where he took a position in the St. Louis University Medical College faculty as assistant professor in nervous diseases and internal medicine. His research into tuberculosis, which he was carrying on when he died, was considered of great value by his colleagues. Will was working in his home laboratory in 1905 when he left the cork open on a bottle of benzene. The vapor reached the flame of a Bunsen burner, and the bottle exploded, showering the burning liquid over the physician's clothing. Mary ran to assist, and a neighbor passing by tried to help. 3 doctors were summoned when the pain became too great, but Will died shortly after they arrived. Son John was just 4 years old. Mary returned to Tyro to live with her parents, paid off the family farm, and bought another family farm. Distraught over the accident, she went to Washington State to stay at Will's brother's sanitarium for some time. She would have several breakdowns and hospitalizations throughout her life. Mary represented Shelby at 2 state conventions in 1913. At the Cleveland Convention, she was one of 96 women from across the state. The decision was made to submit its cause directly to the people by a petition of 10% of the voters. They wanted to create a more educational campaign, and they recommended that work be pushed forward by means of county societies. So Mary became the head of the Women's Suffrage Association of Richland County. The Columbus Convention was attended by 300 women from across the state, including Mary Rininger. Rininger was selected as one of 15 alternates to a national convention in Philadelphia. The preamble of the Women's Suffrage Association of Richland County read, "Viewing with hope and satisfaction the advance of the women's suffrage movement in Ohio, believing that victory is to be attained by the further extension of educational methods, the Equal Franchise Association of Shelby now and hereby becomes the Women's Suffrage Association of Richland County. With this change comes a broader field, a wider cooperation, a renewed fervor, and faith in the ultimate granting of the ballot to the women of Ohio upon equal terms with Ohio men." Mary and her son John were among 5,000 women suffragists who marched, while 250,000 people watched the demonstration before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson in Washington, D.C., March 4, 1913. Rininger's story was carried by the wire services. She claimed that she became a suffragist because of Agriculture Secretary Put Sandals. "I was never interested in the women's suffrage question until Mr. Sandals absolutely refused to pay any attention to my letters on business connected with his official duties. One day last summer, I wrote to the Secretary of Agriculture asking him for some information relative to Institute work. I waited for some weeks without receiving any reply and tried the experiment of writing the same letter and signing my father's name. By return mail, I received a reply." John, who was just 12 years old, carried a purple banner at the front of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association that said Harrison, Hayes, Garfield, McKinley, and Taft. Mary Rininger recounts later that the crowd surged in on them, police unable to help. Men who arrived for the inauguration shouted vulgarities. A cavalry from Fort Myers took charge. "I had the most terrible thought that I had brought my boy to Washington to be crushed," she said. The Daily Globe published several promotional articles prior to anti-suffragist Miss Lucy Price coming to town in August. Price was in her 20s and the youngest anti-suffragist in the movement. She said, "Shelby is going to be one of our anti-suffrage strongholds, I believe. I have been here 3 days and have talked to a great many people, and I have found only 3 suffragists in the place. And only one of them was perfectly sure she was a suffragist. Yes, it was a woman. The men all seem to be antis or else on the fence, waiting to learn what the women want." During her speech, she said, "If you do vote for women's suffrage, you are forcing every woman in Ohio into political warfare, the great majority of them against their wills. And those women who stand indifferently by and say, 'I shall never vote, but I guess I won't fight against it for others,' simply have not awakened to a realization of what it means." Lizzie Marvin reviewed the speech in the Globe, saying, "The anti-suffrage speaker at City Hall Monday evening, instead of presenting logical reasons why women should be denied the ballot, spent much of the time in eulogizing legislation on non-suffrage states and in veiled sarcasm toward the body of suffragists who are fair enough to add their presence to an exceedingly small crowd." To say that homes would be disrupted should one more of its members be given the power of self-government is an insult to the manhood and a libel upon the womanhood of Ohio. The American home still stands in Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Washington, and California. In November, 800 women in a town of 5,000 inhabitants turned out to vote for Anna Fish on the ballot. Mary says she thinks the turnout fully vindicates the cause of equal suffrage. Even though the female turnout was high, Anna Fish lost the school board election. Mary, Rininger, and John attend the Women's Suffrage Convention in Cincinnati. At 12, John is mentioned as the youngest suffrage worker in Ohio. In April of 1914, the Women's Suffrage Association of Richland County decides the annual city cleanup would be a good time to promote their cause. Rininger and 46 other women posted yellow "Votes for Women" signs on barrels and boxes containing rubbish. They covered the town completely, each lady posting stickers in her section of the city. At the home of Rininger's neighbor, George Cole, on Marvin Avenue, barrels and boxes were covered by about 25 stickers. Mr. Cole was opposed to suffrage. A disgruntled Mr. Cole wrote to the Daily Globe, and Mary provided a rebuttal. "After a talk with Mr. George Cole, I think he wishes me to state that he was misplaced and misquoted, using the words in your article of last Monday." The rubbish, which was furnace and pipes, not boxes and barrels, was not labeled in the early morning because I feared Mr. Cole would turn the pipes, etc., over and then joke me by calling my attention to how easy it was to turn Votes for Women down. I waited until afternoon when the pile looked properly anchored and labeled it with 3 others on Marvin and several on Jennings Court. In July 1914, women delivered over 120,000 names in 56 counties to Secretary Graves. Over 900 names were from Richland County. Shelby women were in attendance for the event. This time, Sharon Township, as well as the state, voted the measure down. Prohibition in the state and the township won, however. Lizzie and Mary wrote a letter to the Globe thanking the voters. "We are grateful to those men who voted yes on women's suffrage amendment and assure them that in our fight for human liberty we are relentless. Plans are now in progress for a renewal of the battle. Nothing is ever settled until it is settled right. Women must have the ballot in Ohio, and the men and women will fight for it until attained." World War I and the 1918 influenza epidemic would slow women's progress to earn the right to vote in Ohio and across the nation. The National Suffrage Association tried to continue the push in 1917, but Congress made it clear they would only consider war measures. In 1917, Shelby women formed the Women's Council for National Defense. It was one of 78 county and 450 township organizations in the state. The movement was proposed by Herbert C. Hoover, food administrator in Washington, D.C. Women participated in the Red Cross, Liberty Loan drives, and food conservation measures. Shelby women organized farmers' markets for local farmers to sell produce. The group disbanded in 1932 and donated the remaining funds to the American Legion. By 1916, the suffrage organizations were united behind the goal of a constitutional amendment rather than amendments by state. On May 21, 1919, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the 19th Amendment. 2 weeks later, the Senate followed. The amendment still had to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, or 36 states at the time. Delays came as some of the legislatures were not scheduled to be in session until the following year. The Ohio legislature came back from recess specifically to consider the amendment. The House voted 73-6 in support of the amendment, and the state senators voted 27-3. Ohio became the 5th state to ratify. State suffragists were on hand in the Senate to watch the proceedings. In addition, the Ohio legislature passed the Reynolds-Fouts presidential suffrage bill, ensuring the right for Ohio women to vote in 1920. The 19th Amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." It was ratified August 18, 1920. Senator Warren G. Harding was nominated as the Republican nomination for president in 1920. Mary Rininger attended the Notification Day festivities at Harding's home in Marion. She took a train in Marion in time for a parade in the morning. A couple of women helped her carry the same purple banner that son John had carried in 1913 in Washington, D.C. Above the president's names on the banner was the name of Harding. She offers a beautiful account of the day, ending with, "I have been wondering, who really did neglect the home? Did the women who pioneered suffrage and did not cook and make beds neglect the home? Or may we not see in the future it was the talented women who refused to help, or the indifferent woman who did not care about the vote?" I would like to thank the Shelby Foundation Women's Fund and Marvin Memorial Library for making this presentation possible.